Today we're going to talk about regenerating hardwoods in Mississippi. My name is Randy Russo. I'm Associate Extension Research Professor, really a hardwood specialist for the Forestry Department and Extension. So what we're going to do is go through over some of the key aspects of hardwood management as a background. We'll look at important hardwood concepts and then get into the factors that will determine regeneration through the future, as well as look into natural regeneration as well as artificial regeneration. The two key aspects that we're going to talk about in hardwood management today is that you really need to remember is pine management is not hardwood management. Pine is very, very plastic. Across the southeast, we plant basically only one species, that being loblolly pine. It fits a number of different sites and grows excellent across those sites. Hardwood species are quite numerous. We have over 70 hardwood species, and they tend to be very site demanding and specific to that particular site. So the second most important key aspect that we'll have to remember is soil-site species relationships. Very few commercially valuable species will either grow under very wet type of conditions or very dry types of sites. We're looking at 6 type of important hardwood management concepts before we get into regeneration. Understand that quality hardwoods need soils that are extremely deep and fertile and lack restrictive layers. Natural regeneration is favored simply because of the cost is much cheaper, and because of hardwoods, we're going to have an extended rotation length of somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 years. We also look at during the regeneration process, if there's a lack of sunlight, this will greatly limit the regeneration and growth of most of our very high valued hardwoods. Our preferred hardwood species are usually intolerant to moderately intolerant in terms of shade tolerance. Disturbance is really needed during the and harvest will cause this and necessary to regenerate our hardwood stands. Plantations management has been done in the past and is focused on the production of hardwoods, or specifically oaks. However, this has not been perfected, especially when we look at producing quality type of hardwoods, which oak falls into this category. We also have to be realistic and learn that there are numerous of stress factors due to off-site planting. We use artificially regeneration that's going to definitely limit both our growth rates as well as the quality of our hardwoods. So we're looking at 4 factors that really determine regeneration system we use. The very most important factor is what are the landowner's objectives? Secondly, what are the desired species that we'd like to have? And then understanding, can these desired species actually grow on this particular site? That's where we get into the species-site relationships. Thirdly, we look at shade tolerance for both germinating the seedlings as well as seedling development as we move them into a more sapling stage. And finally, we have to really match the species and the condition of the existing stand to those particular sites. So the very first thing we'd like to go over is species-site relationships, because there are a large number of hardwood species that are specific to a specific site and environmental characteristics or even soil conditions. Two actual aspects that draw together are what are the suitable sites, and then what are the suitable species to those particular sites, thus a species-site relationship. If these 2 factors really aren't matched correctly, growth rates will usually be poor and there will be replacement by other species. Mortality will add up to a loss of money and a loss of time as well. So what sites are unsuitable for quality hardwoods? Well, very dry sites because of low moisture availability, or very wet sites because of low oxygen in the root zone. Sites with hard pans will limit the root zone as well. Heavily erodible sites, you have a loss of suitable soils and texture as well as nutrients. What you're seeing here is that you're looking at a loss of material in the actual rooting zone of the plant. So we need rather good soils for those high quality types of hardwoods. So what is an optimal hardwood site? Really, deep, silty to sandy loam soils are the best. And these depth of these soils need to be somewhere between the neighborhood of 36 to 60 inches. They need to be fertile. They have to have good moisture availability during the growing season, as well as good soil aeration. If they do not, these trees will not produce, these sites will not produce quality type of trees. The soil pH needs to be neutral to slightly acidic in most cases. It also needs to be free of pans or any restrictive layers that might limit the root growth, as we've seen in the previous slides. So if we look at the designation between soils and where they actually lay on the landscape, you look at the front as being something that has a good surface, good internal drainage, has a loam to sandy loam soils in these areas, and they'll produce species or grow species well, such as cottonwood, sycamore, pecan, various oak species, sweet gum, and green ash. If we look at the next layer, we look at the ridge sites. These are moderately surface and internal drainage to it. Really not as fertile as the fronts because they've aged a little bit. But here's where you find your most important species. You'll look cherry bark oak, pin oak, willow oak, water oak, green ash, and even sweet gum on these particular sites. As we get to a little lower site, we get into the flats, which has poor internal as well as surface drainage. They have a higher clay content, and you find species a little lower value, not all oak, overcup oak, some high value like green ash, but then you tend to get some more undesirable species such as sugarberry and water hickory. A little lower, we find our slough areas. These have poor drainage and really easily inundated. They have a very high clay content. Only species that you find here are those that can actually live in poor drained areas such as black willow, overcup oak, and water oak. If we move out of the bottomlands and into a minor stream bottom, you find that the stream terrace here is also an exceptionally good site. But it's rather generally very narrow, but it has good nutrient availability, good fertility as well. And you find some very, very valuable species here, such as northern red oak, southern red oak, sweet pecan, yellow poplar, black walnut, and even black cherry. So if we look at what are the soil site conditions specifically for, let's say, oaks. If we look at saturated soils that have good fertility, we'll find that we have overcup oak, nut all oak, water oak, and pin oak in that area. If we look at soils that are moist but have high fertility, we find that we have cherry bark oak, swamp chestnut, and shoemort. If we find moist and medium fertility site conditions, we'll have the same species as above, which are the most highly preferred hardwoods available, and then we'll get also into some willow oak and water oak. If we get at the little drier site, medium fertility, we find still good species, southern red oak, white oak, and shoemort. However, if we drop to a dry, low fertility site, then we have less desirable species of oak such as scarlet oak, blackjack oak, and post oak. Well, what about if we have different sites that have high pH soils? We have pH soils that exist that are above 7.5. The only oaks that will live on those type of soils will be shoemort and overcup, with shoemort being the most desirable of those two species. So for producing quality hardwoods, we have to have deep, fertile soils that are very moist and also have good aerations. We really need to allow the time for the trees to express their quality characteristics. So management has to allow for rotation time to be cut by favoring our select trees or our crop trees and harvesting those trees of less quality. So what are your specific objectives if you're managing hardwoods? First of all, maybe timber, maybe wildlife, maybe recreation, or it's just passed down to your kids in a legacy type of form. Maybe it's maximum income or some sort of combination of all of these. No matter what the objectives are, you have to be aware of the costs and the paths that lead to obtaining these particular objectives. Thus, if we say we favor both wildlife and timber, we're going to have to give a little bit up from the wildlife end, and we're going to have to give a little bit up from the timber end. We can't favor one and disrespectful of the other individual. So if we look at a simple decision chart, we can see that the landowner objectives is the number one thing that we have to consider. Follow that by a stand site assessment before we go any further within our decision chart. So with stand assessments, we're looking, what does the current stand look like today? Well, we want to determine what are the age groups out there. Do we have multiple age groups? What kind of species do we makeup do we have? And more or less general terms, oak, hickory, and other species. Stand condition has to be looked at. Have we degraded that stand? Do we need to rehabilitate that particular stand? As well as understanding what stage of development. Are we in the seedling, the sapling, or are we in the pole stage of the stand development? And are the species that dominate the stand capable of producing high valuable saw timber down the road? So as the stand ages, we're trying to develop the highest log quality that we can get. So this drives our entire system throughout the entire process of our management, even when we move into regeneration. So if the log quality of high value species is low, then our management will typically favor regeneration and then manage that. If our log quality of our desired species is very high, we'll continue on managing that stand till we reach economic viability or the landowner has reasons to regenerate that particular stand. This particular slide shows a stand out of the Knoxville Wildlife Refuge. It's in about the 90-year range. You can see this very high quality oak species on this site, a number of oaks. Where we have swamp chestnut, we have cherry bark oak in here. We also have water and willow oak. This stand has reached economic maturation. However, biologically, it could grow for about another 60 or 70 years. However, we have to begin to think about the risk factors that will come into play during the remaining age of the stand. So if we look at back on our flow chart, we look at the landowner's objectives, we've made our stand site assessment, we figure that it's acceptable for forest management, so we're going to manage our stand, but we're going to manage it through some sort of thinning. So the basis of our cuts will always be, when we're moving out, we're improving the stand as we move through these thinnings. The basal areas should not be the major factor of how we cut the stand. Emphasis should be placed on the density of the desired species and upgrading the stand to achieve the maximum growth over the highest quality trees over the life of the stand. So stand assessment information that's needed to regenerate this particular, manage this particular stand includes site conditions, stocking of desirable species, quality or grade of the desirable species, crown class, and tree vigor. If we look at actual shade tolerance and those species which we determined as being the preferred species in aspect of timber value, cherry bark oak, shoe-marred oak, swamp chestnut, white oaks, and sweet pecan, notice that they all fall into the intolerant to moderately intolerant shade tolerant class. Subsequently, when we regenerate this material, we'll have to have fairly open sunlight to get this material to actually germinate and grow through the seedling stage. Ash, on the other hand, green ash and other ash species are moderately tolerant, but still fall in the preferred species category. Our desired species, such as yellow poplar, cottonwood, and sycamore, even some of the oaks, water and willow oak, basically are lower in value. But notice that the cottonwood and the sycamore and yellow poplar are very intolerant species for their terms of shade tolerance. So we need to actually understand how we can regenerate those particular species. We look at persimmon and sugarberry, very desirable species, but they're very tolerant, so they can actually germinate and grow under shaded type of conditions. Those species which are acceptable, but basically much lower value, are your honey locusts, shagbark hickories, red maples, and magnolia, as well as tupelo and elm. So our most preferred species actually fall more into the intolerant shade tolerance, as well as moderately intolerant. If we look at our tree class, we've broken these down to 4 different types of class. We have the preferred trees. These are our highest quality trees. These are the trees that we're going to make the most money off of, and these are the trees we're going to leave in our stand till we cut this particular stand. Then we have reserve trees. Those trees that are good trees, desirable species, but they need additional growth in order to add value. Then we have our cutting stock. Those are the trees that will add very little value with age, or maybe even undesirable trees we'd like to get out of the stand. And finally, the cull trees. These are damaged, poor, maybe even unacceptable trees. We might want them for actual wildlife purposes, but we would not want too many of those in our particular stand on a per acre basis. If we looked at them actually in a picture, we can see the preferred trees. Again, very high quality, very, very clean bowl, no limbs on the bowl, very high return from that particular tree. Reserve tree, you notice that there are branches in the lower log length of it. These epicormic branches will take time to actually heal over and produce a quality tree, or move from a reserve class over to the preferred class. The cutting stock individuals are those individuals that have actually poor quality, very large limb, knotty on it, and we really can't get much out. So the cutting stock looks at undesirable trees and those trees that actually are not going to make it to the next cutting cycle. And then we have our cull trees. Those would be more wildlife trees that we might left on the site. Maybe we will get them out if they're actually impeding on the growth of other preferred or reserve type class trees. If we look at the crown classification system, we're looking at understanding the difference between a dominant, codominant, intermediate, and suppressed trees, looking at how much light intercept is going on in there. We're actually separating our trees about mid-level of our crown, upper level of our crown, and a dominant tree will get not only light from above, but light from the side, all around the side through half of the crown shade. If we look at our codominants, we get light from above, but we don't get a good indirect sunlight from the side as well. If we look at our intermediate trees, those are trees that are only going to get light from above. You can see as the dominant and the codominant actually continue to expand on their crowns, intermediates will actually fall into the suppressed stage and eventually drop out of the stand. Our tree vigor also reflects how much growth we can expect through time. If we have a tree as shown in this slide where we see dieback of the upper crown canopy, not a lot of leaf system is showing right there on the left-hand side of the tree, what you're going to do is limit the amount of growth in the future, as well as the ability for that tree to expand and perform as a high quality individual. So we're going to evaluate both crown depth, density, and balance. So we've looked back to our decision model. We look at the objectives. Now the stand site assessment, we find that it's unacceptable for forest management. So now we're going to regenerate that stand, but we're going to regenerate it hopefully through natural regeneration. So we have to look at our stand, and we have to specifically look at the advanced regeneration, both the numbers that exist as well as the species that exist. So what are our steps in natural regeneration? Stand assessment, which we've done, we used to determine the presence and the distribution of desirable species on site, as well as how much advanced regeneration that we have, how much seedling from those desired trees are actually in that particular area, and how many individuals will actually think we can survive the grow as the seedlings. Pre-harvest preparation, if there are not enough desirable species, then we're going to have to go in and actually do some cutting. And we'll remove both non-desirable and heavy, and actually in the heavy, mid, and understory. Then we'll look at a partial overstory removal if we have to, and we're going to leave about 50 square feet of base area, and we're going to hopefully, we have to, not hopefully, have to time this with a good seed crop. And finally, after all that's completed, we have our advanced regeneration seedlings coming along. We're going to have to remove that overstory. Not necessarily have to remove it, but we'd like to remove it in about 3 to 5 years and get our new stand growing up. So what type of silvicultural regeneration systems will we use? Well, for clear cuts, we need those that provide full sunlight to the soil, favors the growth of species that are very intolerant, and for most part, it's going to be light-seeded species. However, along the edges of the stand, you'll find that we have the heavier seed species such as oaks and pecan. Seed trees, this is going to favor a light-seeded species, has to have bare mineral soil required for most of the wind-type blown species. And then finally, shelter wood. This is usually used on oak species, and it depends on the cutting density will actually dictate the variance tolerance in terms of how much shade will be actually put on the ground and what type of species that you would favor. Heavier cuts would favor more intolerant, shade intolerant species. Shallower cuts or lighter cuts will actually favor more shade tolerant species, those of lesser timber value. And group selections, this is where small groups of mature trees throughout the stand are removed from the stand at periodic conditions. And we've actually added on, I've added on patch clear cuts. These are small clear cuts from anywhere from 2 to 15 acres, which is going to create both a matrix of small even age groups, but overall, if you look at it at a landscape level, it's looking at looks similar to what you would see as an uneven age type of system. Finally, single tree selection. This is just the removal of only a single mature individual, and this really favors more shade tolerant individuals simply because removal of a single individual doesn't usually put enough full sunlight on the ground to allow for more intolerant species to take over. So this would be used in more of an uneven age stand type of management. Well, for our pre-harvest preparation, we have to look at our stand assessment. An abundance of desirable advanced regeneration of desirable species, we have no need to actually do a site pre-harvest preparation. However, if there's no advanced regeneration of desirable species and we have a heavy mid-story, heavy understory of undesirable species, we're going to have to go in there and do something actually to allow more sunlight to reach the ground. This means of removal of this material in the mid-story and understory prior to harvest to allow enough sunlight for advanced regeneration to take hold of the species from our desired class. This is going to usually be done by injection of these particular undesirable trees with a herbicide type of system. This will not only provide needed sunlight, but it also provides the water and the nutrients that it needs for this seedling not to only germinate, but actually grow into a larger sapling. This is an actual shot of a slide on Noxby again. Advanced regeneration is overhead high. This is about 6 foot tall advanced regeneration. And this is what we're looking at, removal of the mid-story and understory so that we can actually get our more desired tree seeds up and growing rapidly. The same is true for some cases where if this seedling, in this slide, the seedling is growing well, but if we don't remove other individuals from around it, we could actually have this seedling fall out of the stand or actually just degenerate till there's really no reserves left, and then mortality would incur. So we need to release these types of seedlings from mid-story and understory species. Sometimes that's just not enough. If we remove the undesirables from the mid-story and understory, there may be more that we need to do to get more sunlight to reach the ground. So that means removal of partial portions of the overstory. This removal we could actually take out would be maybe any large undesirable species that we have, but in most cases what it means that we're going to have to take out some of the desirable species that are in the dominant and co-dominant stage. So removing of those means that we want to remove still the actually worst favor the best in that particular stand. So it's got to also be timed with a good seed crop so that the seed can germinate and become established while conditions are really suitable for that seedling and sapling type of growth. So final overstory removal, this usually occurs about 3 to 5 years after we've done our pre-harvest prep or maybe our partial overstory removal. What this is going to do is allow us to take off the best trees, get the revenue from those individual trees. However, some individuals would like to see that final overstory actually remain. What sort of problems would that give us if we leave that? Well, it becomes susceptible. Those trees become susceptible for a number of different agents. Weather is one of them, lightning strikes, heavy wind, pests, insects, might result in a total loss of this material. Also, these trees will actually interfere with the development of the new stand. Those will actually cause more shading to those individuals through time that we would like to get up and form our future stand. So, back to our decision-making model, we look at, again, the landowner's objectives. We move through our stand site assessment. Now we're looking at what about fields, clear cuts, or lack of desired species that exist in that stand. What can we do to regenerate it? So now we have to proceed down the artificial regeneration type path. Again, that means a whole new set of problems for us as well. So what are the important aspects of plantation management? First and foremost, as we stated before, species-site relationships are critical. Off-site planting, we're going to result in poor growth. They're going to give us disease possibilities or eventually maybe even extensive mortality. So we need to understand our soil classification, our drainage, and how this will affect both our growth, site preparation, our establishment, and our care, and later on our growth. We also have to be quite aware of where these seedlings are coming from, the seed source. Are they genetically improved stock? What is the origin of this particular seed? In genetics for hardwoods, we'd like to use improved seed or seed sources at the very least. However, we realize that improved oak, genetically improved oak, is really only becoming available today. There are some species like cottonwood, sycamore, sweet gum that have improved seed sources or improved seed in the seedlings. We should actually utilize this material if we're planting that type of species. However, if you cannot get a hold of genetically improved seedlings, look at what's the best seed for your appropriate sites. If I have a bottomland site, I'd like to have seed from a bottomland area. If I have an upland site, I'd like to take seed from an upland area and form my seedlings. Understand what is local seed and what is not. Local seed means from that particular planting site, a radius of about 100 miles is what we would term a local seed. Never move seed from north to south. Always try to move from seed from south to north. Spacing of our trees per acre, this is going to greatly vary by the particular species as well as our specific product. If we're looking for pulpwood, maybe a 12 by 12 foot spacing. If we're looking at biomass, probably even a much tighter spacing, maybe a 6 by 3 foot type of spacing. What about saw timber? Then eventually we're going to get to a very, very wide spacing. So also, the type of care will vary by the species that you're growing and the product you're growing. If I'm growing, say, cottonwood for pulpwood, then we have to have the machinery that can tend to those particular situations so that tree does not become slowed in their growth rates from the actual competition of both vines or herbaceous competition. So what type of stock or seedlings that we're looking at? There are really 3 general categories. There are bare root seedlings, no matter whether they're 1-0 stock or 2-0 stock. 1.0 being grown in the nursery for 1 year, 2.0 stock being grown in the nursery 2 years. But we like to plant those either in the late fall to late spring, and that really depends on weather conditions and storage. We don't want to store our seedlings for any longer than we have to in a cooler. If you have to store them, you have to store them at 35 degrees or so. Try not to store them for more than three months. Containerized seedlings, this provides us the ability to extend the planting season later into the year and actually match our particular conditions, weather conditions, with the seedlings for optimal survival of our trees. Cuttings, these are used for species that root very well, such as cottonwood, black willow, and even sycamore. These cuttings are usually anywhere between 15 to 18 inches in length, no more than what looks to be a stick, and pushed into the ground. Those individuals have preformed root initials on the cutting, as well as buds that will actually form the shoot above ground. So really, what is a good seedling? Here I've depicted a nut all oak seedling, 1.0 type of bare root stock, both seedling A and B, with A being the high quality individual, B being the poor individual. What's the first act we're looking at is what type of root collar diameter that we have. We need a root collar diameter that is between 3/8 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch in diameter. We also look at the number of first order lateral roots. Here are the larger primary roots that stick out on either side. These individuals should be somewhere between 8 to 10 individual first order lateral roots. And then secondly, we're looking at the actual taproot length and diameter of that taproot. We like to have the taproot length be at least 10 inches long. And then of course, numerous buds for increased leaf area, which will actually help us in producing sugar or food for that particular seedling as it grows. You notice that seedling B has none of those qualities whatsoever. You have very, very poor root collar diameter. You have no first order lateral roots, hardly at all. The tap root is long enough, however, it is not the diameter that we would require, nor do we have the buds that we need for increased photosynthetic area. So what are the keys to a successful hardwood plantation? Number one, we've got to match our species to the site. That's the key. Secondly, we've got to complete a proper site preparation, which will include both chemicals as well as disking, and then finally subsoiling. Thirdly, we have to plant quality seedlings of known origin and genetic basis. And finally, we need to control our vegetation at least during the first few months following establishment. If we can control the vegetation during the first few months for more shade or shade intolerant species such as oaks, we'll be in good shape. However, for more or highly shade intolerant trees like sycamore, cottonwood, willow, we have to control the vegetation through the entire growing season or we will lose growth. And we're wanting to capitalize for those species because we're producing those for biomass or bioenergy. We're going to have to capitalize on that early rapid growth. So to do this, again, we're going back to the Baker Broadfoot system. We're looking at our 4 factors: the soil physical properties, actual texture type of characteristics. We're looking at a moisture availability, soil aeration, and nutrient availability. I've listed a table on the presentation that shows a site evaluation for cherry bark oak. You can see that if I have a deep soil greater than 4 feet, I've given a grade of 6. However, if I have a shallow soil, less than 2 feet, or soil with an inherent pan, it's going to receive a grade of a -2. So subsequently, you can see that how well the soil depth, how much the soil depth plays in favor of a high value species such as oak. You look at compaction in the in the surface foot, no compaction. Again, I give it a grade of 6. However, if I go to a strongly compacted, high bulk density soils, it's going to give it a grade of -2. Again, we're losing dramatic numbers in terms of what actually is a good site index for cherry bark oak. If we look at what type of preparation we do before planting, there's a number of different things we can do. Of course, if you look at the top left-hand corner, this is an area that's been disked and then bedded, as well as the bottom right-hand side. However, if you're planting any fields or planting any hardwoods, really, we should actually subsoil the ground. The top right-hand slide shows what we call an eco-till implement. Basically, will allow us to actually set the spacing at any space we want with this particular implement. The bottom left-hand slide shows a cottonwood, which is being ripped and row marked at a 12 by 12 foot spacing so that it can be actually tended, disked in both directions to control competing vegetation. Of course, plant quality is important. We need to know where our seedlings come from and the genetic basis of that material. If I have good genetic material, but it comes from Indiana and I'm trying to plant in Mississippi, that should not happen. We should never move seedlings, as I said, from north to down to south plant areas. Plant more local seed if you have that capability. Control your vegetation, at least during the first few months following establishment will give your seedlings the growth, the sunlight, the availability of actually nutrients and water, as well as open up the soil for aeration. So what happens under the characteristics of an oak development? What we have is, because we have full sunlight, we have slow initial height growth. The seedlings right then, that first year, the second year, they're building up a large root system. Accelerated height growth follows the root production. Trees begin to overtop the herbaceous competition, and crowns really begin to expand very greatly. Then we come into our 15 to 20 years of age, we have crown closure. We get intensification of our tree-to-tree competition. This is followed by a very, very slow progression of suppression, and then followed by mortality. Without thinning, we would get more suppression and more mortality, but our growth rates would be dramatically slower. So when we get into this crown closure portion, we need to think about thinning our particular stands. There is one other way of actually artificial regeneration, and that's through direct seeding. This usually has occurred for primarily oaks, a heavier seeded species, which can be regenerated either by sowing directly to the site, or we basically actually can do it by hand or by implements. You collect your fresh acorns, we clean off the damaged acorns by floating them, seal those acorns in plastic bags at 35 degrees until we're ready for planting. When we plant or sow the seed, we want to get them to a depth of about 2 inches, and we're trying to sow at high rates of anywhere between 700 to 1,000 seed per acre so that we can ensure adequate survival rates. But we need to remember at that particular time, once we get start good seedling development very early, at age 3 or so, we need to remove our excess seedlings, because if we don't, we're going to have problems later on. Numerous occasions I've seen 20-year-old stands that have been direct seeded, way too many trees on a per acre basis, and it's very hard to do anything with these trees right now other than actually remove rows of individuals of trees. The final thing that we'd like to talk about is really the high grading of stands, and this is something that's been commonplace in hardwoods. These are stands that really have resulted from decades of removal only the very best, the most desirable species, and leaving only the rest or the worst. Site quality in these high grading stands is really critical, and if this high site quality, then we have a higher probability of improving the stand and increasing the likelihood of rehabilitating that particular stand. If we have four options we can take under these high graded stands. We can naturally regenerate the stand if there are enough high quality trees to serve as parent trees. Generally, this does not occur. If we look at the second option, it's being artificially regenerate the stand. This is the easiest one to do, the easiest decision to make. However, then we have to come into effect of what it will cost us to actually artificially regenerate that stand. Thirdly, we can try to rehabilitate the stand itself. Or finally, we can just leave it alone, let nature take its course, and accept whatever we get out of it. If we are trying to rehabilitate the stand, we're going to have to take simple steps. A modification of Clearcut techniques, but these will usually be in smaller sizes, and really want them adjacent to more of the desirable species if we can find that. Secondly, we want to control our undesirable species in the mid-story and understory, and then infuse it with a seedlings of the desired species, but not at the rate that you would do a plantation. So it becomes a sort of a hybrid type of scenario between natural regeneration of getting an advanced material, advanced regeneration seedling, and that of actual artificial regeneration and plantation. And finally, we can actually release those desired trees a little at a time, hopefully keeping the crop trees, and then we can manage those through time by actually slowly but surely moving those out further and further away by actually natural regeneration. So in summary, hardwoods can be regenerated either naturally or through the use of artificial means, seeds, seedlings, or cuttings. Of course, natural regeneration is going to be the most economical and currently probably the best way to regenerate our stand, as long as you follow the guidelines that we've prescribed. Desired species are present in sufficient numbers, then you can adequately regenerate the site. If they are not, then we're going to have to actually prepare the site for regeneration based on species biological characteristics. If we take artificial regeneration in play, this is going to be very costly, but it also can be very successful. We have to remember to match the species to the particular site. We need our proper site preparation. We need the seedling quality must be followed, as well as planting quality to ensure good survival and growth. Competition control is a must, usually during the very first year of some sort. More intolerant they are, the higher level of competition control is needed. The less shade intolerant they are, the less need for competition control. So with that, I'll leave you. If you have any questions, please call. My name, my number, as well as our email site is shown on the final slide. Thank you very much.